Following the outlier section, we can go on to the distribution of one-year returns, which represents the current performance within the superannuation industry. Here you will need to consider the distribution of one-year returns in isolation, which is one variable analysis. You will then need to consider what factors may influence the one-year returns, and so this means bivariate relationships must also be analysed, but these will go into the next section. To start, we can have an intro sentence plus something to indicate the focus of this section. For example, we could use, there are many funds offering products in the Australian superannuation market. In this section, the superannuation market will be investigated to determine the current levels of returns being achieved. Make sure you then include a reference to the chart, such as Figure 1 illustrates the distribution of one-year returns within the sample of, and remember this will depend on your decision relating to outliers, so say how many fund options being considered. You then need to include a histogram to visually show the distribution of returns. Below you would discuss the key features. Generally a good summary of features will include things like the average, lowest value, highest value, standard deviation and shape. It is also useful to note the modal class. Make sure that you do not just list these figures, but rather you need to tell the story of what is being seen, and so the measures you calculated should be used within sentences. The features then need to be put in context and linked to real life. For example, you could think about and maybe include a basic numerical example comparing the financial impact of being in the highest or lowest funds. You can even think about things like whether the funds generally perform the same, or if there are large differences, and even give some initial indication or suggestions as to why such variation occurs. Finally, a good concluding sentence for this section is to have a lead into the next section. For example, something like, in the next section of the report, factors which may influence the returns, such as the investment type, will be examined. Okay, so now to Excel. In terms of the Excel work, you need to use the built-in functions to calculate all of the numerical measures. I would recommend calculating all the measures, but then thinking about which are best to include so as to describe the key characteristics of the one-year returns data. You will also need to make a histogram to visually show the patterns in the one-year returns data. Create the pivot table and group the returns into classes, keeping in mind that we should be aiming for 7, 8, 9 classes for this amount of data. It is also useful to be able to easily distinguish between positive and negative returns in this context. So it is useful to make sure that there is a class boundary occurring at 0. Remember, you can just try some different class widths with the grouping in Excel and look at the results to help you decide what would be a good class width to use. Make sure your pivot table has a count for each class. Excel will convert the return class boundaries into decimal format rather than percentage, and so if you want them to show as percentage, you will need to then type over the class labels. Turn your pivot table into a histogram and don't forget to format it, including making the gap width 0. Okay, that's it for the third help session. The fourth and final session will be to talk a little bit about the bivariate and trivariate analysis, and that will be released early next week.